Hey pals, I'm here today to recommend 20 amazing audiobooks to you. I love audiobooks. I've got more and more into them in the last few years. I love listening to both fiction and non-fiction on audio. And for each of these audiobooks, I remember precisely where I was, what I was doing at the time of listening to these, because they've really been imprinted on my mind. I love all these as books themselves, but particularly love the audiobook performances of them and think they really shone in that way. So I'm going to talk about the, 13 fiction books first, and then save the 7 non-fiction books for the end. And this has also worked out well for me because I'm talking about all the books narrated by like a professional audiobook narrator first, and then talking about all the books narrated by the authors themselves towards the end. So the first book on the list is Daughter of the Forest. This is written by Juliet Marillier and this is narrated by Terry Donnelly. Now, I'd heard great things about this fantasy book and it's quite pricey to get hold of in the UK. This book was published initially, I think, in Australia, but has been published in North America. And I'm sure you can pick up secondhand copies really cheap over there. I've never seen secondhand copies here or even first-hand copies in a bookshop. And so I decided to give it a go on audio because I didn't really want to spend, risk spending as much as I would need to in case I didn't like it. I loved it, and this is a really long audio because over 20 hours, and I remember living in our previous flat and just lying on the sofa for like 2 days straight just listening to it, which is something I never do. I was so pulled into the story that I literally lied there and didn't do anything else other than just listen because I had to know what was going to happen. If you haven't heard of this, this is the first book in a trilogy, and each of the books in the trilogy follow a daughter of 7 waters, and we move on to the next generation. So each of them has a different character in each of the books. And something I did find interesting about these audiobooks is, as I said, the first one's narrated by Terry Donnelly, and she pronounces the main character's name in a particular way. This is set in like a fantasy world, but it being a historical Ireland, and so all narrators are Irish. The main character's name is, in the first book, is called Saoirse, and that's how it's pronounced by Terry Donnelly. But in the second book, this different narrator pronounces it as, I think, Saoirse, which was quite weird. So I've heard people pronounce it in many different ways. But the narrator is wonderful, and obviously a lot of these names, both of people and places, are very Irish, and I would have 100% pronounced them wrong had I read this. So I really loved having them pronounced for me. It was beautifully performed. And this, like I said, is a fantasy book. It's very slow. There is a romance element in each of them, and it's very much has a lot of sort of like nature-based descriptions, and I just adored it. And I think if you have never read any fantasy and you mainly read literary fiction, but you also enjoy historical fiction, this is a really good place to start because it isn't like super fantastical. And the next one is Silver Sparrow by Tayari Jones. I also love An American Marriage by this author on audio, but this one just was amazing. This one has 2 audiobook narrators, and they are Rosalind Coleman Williams and Heather Alicia Sims. And the reason this has 2 narrators is because this story is set in Atlanta in the mid-1980s, and it follows 2 young girls who are sisters. However, their father is a bigamist. He's married 2 women, their mothers, and one of the families is the secret family, and they know about the other family, who are the public family. But the public family do not know about the secret family. And you're following both these young girls as they're coming of age, and they're starting to ask for things that could mean their paths cross. They're starting to ask for things that you can't afford to pay for both of them. And so this book is a beautiful exploration of each of the young girls coming of age. We look at both of the families, we find out both of the mothers' histories and how the father came to be in this situation. And it is just wonderful, and the narration I thought made such a difference. Both women have beautiful voices. This was such an experience listening to this, and I remember walking around on a really sunny day in a local cemetery, which sounds really not a nice place to walk, but it's a beautiful place. It's Victorian, it has lots of big trees, and it's where I listen to lots of my audiobooks, and I can remember like the precise day I listened to the end of this, and I remember pausing in shock and just rewinding it and rewinding. Listening to bits again because I just loved it, so I'd really recommend this one on audio. The next one is The Offing by Benjamin Myers, and this is narrated by the actor Ralph Ineson. He has a really particular voice, and when I first started listening to this, I was like, I don't know if I'm going to get on with this, but I would say if you've attempted to listen to this, he also narrates a couple other of Benjamin Myers' books, and you thought, maybe that's a bit too deep, a bit too gravelly, then you do get used to it. And in fact, it works magnificently. So this is told from the perspective of an old man, hence this sort of old, gruff voice telling the story. And he's looking back on one summer just after World War II, where he leaves his hometown of Durham to go on a sort of like walking holiday before he joins the family tradition of being a coal miner, which is something he really doesn't want to do. And on his walks, he comes across this older, middle-class, very educated woman called Dulcie. She's very different from him. And he strikes up this friendship with her. And it's about the ways in which they both open the other one up to different aspects of the world and of life, and the ways in which they connect with one another. And there's this sort of secret about Dulcie's past that you find out as you follow the story. It's beautifully written. Benjamin Myers writes like nature writing, like so wonderfully. And usually when I was listening to this, I was almost thinking, oh, this is so beautiful, I would love to be reading this physically so I could like mark sections, but I just couldn't stop myself listening to this because the performance of it is spectacular, and his voice is so distinct, like you couldn't confuse his voice with anyone else's, but I just couldn't imagine continuing the story and not hearing him tell it, so I just thought this was wonderful. The next one is the Subtweet by Vivek Shraya, and this is narrated by Nisha Ahuja. This was brilliant. This is about two women, one called Neela, who is an indie musician, but who hasn't really taken off, and she's very dedicated to her art. She takes it really seriously, and she almost thinks that if she was really successful and popular, then she wouldn't be doing the right thing. But then this YouTube famous musician covers one of her songs. This musician is called Rukmini. She covers Neela's song, and suddenly everyone loves the cover, and they discover Neela's music because of Rukmini. The two then strike up this friendship. It's a very close friendship, very sudden, and they start to spend all their time together. And then one subtweet sort of makes their friendship like implode. So you follow this build up, this really fast build up to this friendship, and then this sort of aftermath of the drama. And the reason I think this is really good on audio is because this book is quite dialogue heavy. There's a lot of scenes where you can tell that there's a conversation happening on one level, and then at least one of the women is trying to say something different to they're actually saying. And I think hearing that narrated makes that come across even better. So I really enjoyed this. Just as a book, it's exploring so many things in quite a short book. It's exploring the idea of fame and popularity, and the idea of like having this online presence and who you really are. And then, I don't want to spoil too much, but the second half really deals with the idea of who owns a story and what truth is. And it's just a really interesting book, and I can't really think of any book I've read that's like it, so I would definitely recommend this one, but in particular on audio. And the next book is The Pull of the Stars by Emma Donoghue. This is narrated beautifully by Emma Lowe. This book is set across 3 days in a maternity ward in Dublin at the height of the Great Flu, and you follow primarily 3 women. One who is a nurse who works on this maternity ward. They're super short staffed. They have lots of women in quite difficult situations who are about to give birth or giving birth. We follow one of the only female doctor who works in the hospital, who has the sort of political leanings that make her fall under suspicion of a lot of the male members of the hospital in particular. And then you follow one of the patients who decides to help in the ward and sort of volunteer. And this is just fantastic. I mean, I can't imagine having read this and not heard Emma Lowe read it, because she read it so beautifully. There's lots of different women on the ward. She gives them all these different unique voices, and you really get the sense of their background from their accents and the way they speak. This book is quite grisly in its detail, like it's on a maternity ward at a time in history when a lot of the methods of getting a baby out when there was difficulties were quite horrific, and I'm quite squeamish, so there was points where I was a bit like, but this is an excellent book that examines the way in which women, both patients and nurses, were treated. It's very frustrating in the fact that a lot of times you just know that this midwife knows way more than the male doctors, but has to appear to know less in order to sort of massage their ego so they'll go along with what she wants, It is just a brilliant historical novel, and it was amazing on audio. Then a book I think a lot of people have read but perhaps not listened to on audio is Such a Fun Age by Kylie Reid. Now, I can't even remember why I decided to pick this one up on audio. I think it was one of those days where I was just hearing loads about it. I watched one review that pushed me over the edge and I couldn't wait to go out and buy a physical copy. So I just started listening to it on audio. And this is narrated brilliantly by Nicole Lewis. I thought she did such a brilliant job. I think a lot of people know the premise of this one, so I'll describe it briefly. We are following this young black woman who is a nanny. She is out with the white child that she looks after in a grocery store, and she is reported for having sort of abducted this child because people assume, why would a young black woman be with a white child? And you follow that story from there. But that's really just sort of the starting point. This book examines race and class privilege. The woman she works for, Alex, is really desperate to be liked and to be seen as cool. And there's lots of really cringy moments in this book, but it just brilliantly explores lots of amazing themes. And what I think for me worked particularly well over audio is that Amira, the nanny, is looking after this young girl who's around 4 or 5, and there's quite a lot of scenes of dialogue between them. And I just thought she did such a wonderful job of voicing all these adult characters, but then also giving this really wonderful voice to the child. This is one of those books I remember as there being a child character that I especially loved, and I just thought their connection was beautiful, and it was really well evoked on audio. There's also a lot of moments of awkward dialogue, which I think came across really well on audio, so it's another reason to listen to this one. Then we have A Single Thread by Tracy Chevalier. This is narrated by Fenella Woolgar. This is set during the interwar years in Winchester, and we follow a woman called Violet, who is what were called at the time one of the surplus women. So during the interwar years, there were a lot less men, and so a lot of women were unmarried at an age where people thought they should be married. And she's been living with her mother, and she's quite unhappy, and she decides to go and rent her own room and try and sort of start this single life. And this is quite a slow story. You follow her as she tries to start that life. Winchester Cathedral plays quite a big part in this, and it's just beautifully described. And this book at its heart has a romance, and I just had such fun with this book. When I think of cozy and sort of heartwarming books that I've read, which aren't many, this is one of the ones that comes to mind the most. And I just remember specific scenes from this novel and listened to them and just loving the way this is narrated. And again, this is one of those books that, because of the historical time period, even though I'm English and this book is set in England, I still really appreciated hearing the accents and the way people would have spoken then, which, in the large part is very different to today. And yeah, I just really enjoyed this one. Then when I think of audiobooks, this is always one of the ones that comes to mind as just one of the best performances I've ever listened to. And that is of Mr. Loverman by Bernardine Evaristo, and it's narrated by James Good. Now, I still think I would have really enjoyed this book had I read it, but I cannot express how much difference I think listening to this on audio made for me. This was just amazing. I definitely need to listen to more books narrated by James Good. So the premise of this is we follow this elderly man who is living in Hackney in London and has lived there since the 60s, but he's originally from Antigua, and he is married to a woman called Carmel, and he has been having an affair with his male best friend since they were both young boys in Antigua. And you look back and you follow how they started this affair, how he started his relationship with Carmel, and you move through his life as he has these 2 daughters, and you move up to the present day and sort of see their story. Most of the book is narrated by Barrington, but some of the book is narrated by Carmel. And I remember precisely where I was at the moment when her voice first came into the novel, and I was just in shock, because I think when you have a physical book, I would have flicked through and seen that it switched to her, but I didn't. So when it switched to her, and he did such an amazing job of her voice as well, and it was a really different voice, I was blown away. I remember one scene in particular where Carmel is sitting at the kitchen table with a few of her friends, and they're all talking about people from back home, and the way in which he narrates all these different women's voices and this sort of really quick fire dialogue was just beautiful. This book is really layered and complex because on the one hand, you love Barrington. He's this super cool old man that you'd sort of see walking around Hackney in all these really sharp suits, like he's really dapper and he's really funny. But at the same time, he's a misogynist. He's quite homophobic. He doesn't like what he calls camp gay men and he avoids them because he doesn't want to be tarred with the same brush. So this is a really interesting exploration of race, class, gender, family dynamics, and I just loved this one. And the audio, I think, is the way to go with this because James Good just is amazing. And then I had to include a book by my favourite author and one of my favourite audiobook narrators. That is The Night Watch, written by Sarah Waters and narrated by Unita McMahon. I think she narrates at least one of Sarah Waters' other books, and I've listened now to 4 of her books on audio, and they are all amazing on audio. This one stands out for me in particular because, like I said, I love this audiobook narrator. This is probably my favourite book set around this time period, and I've read quite a few of them. I completely get when people say they don't enjoy books set during the war, like reading about the actual battles and things like that. But what I do love is reading about books set during the interwar years or even during the war years, but following the people left at home and how they dealt with the rations and the fear and like waiting for the letters to come home. I just think it is a really interesting time period to look at, and this book does it beautifully. So this book opens in the late 1940s. I think it's told in about 5 sections, and each section jumps back a couple of years. So the book ends with its beginning in 1941, which is mind-blowing. Like, that sounds like you'd be like, well, like, why am I looking forward to the end? Because I know everything, but you don't, because you, like I said, start in late 1940s and you see these 4 characters, you're following 3 women and 1 man. You see them in these situations and you don't know how they got there. So you start to make assumptions, and your assumptions will be wrong. And so as you move back, you find out what actually happened to get them there. And what's also really interesting about this book is that where the book opens at the end, some of the characters are in a good place and some are in a bad place. But then when you go back to the beginning, that could be different for any of those characters. And so you sort of get left with what feels like quite a few of them is this happy ending at the actual end of the book. But you know it isn't, because you know what happens in the following like 8 to 10 years. It is amazing, and she does such a brilliant job of narrating these 4 different voices and all of the wider cast around them. She does all these different London accents. I just think she's an amazing audiobook narrator. And even though this is, like I said, you know, set across those time periods and has multiple characters, I still think this is really easy to follow on audio. I think you can completely follow what's going on, and yeah, I love this. This is one of my favourite books, so I'd highly recommend this on audio. The next 2 books I've bunched together for 3 reasons. Firstly, they have multiple narrators because they're multiple point of view novels. Secondly, I listened to these whilst reading them, and the reason I did that is because they are very lyrically written, very wordy, and sometimes quite cerebral. And so I sort of wanted to follow the words on the page. But I wouldn't say, well, don't audiobook them because you should read them, because the audiobook narrators are phenomenal and add so much to the story, like so much. I can't imagine not having audiobook these. And in fact, because I had the physical copy, sometimes I was like, I'm just going to sit and like read physically because I can read a bit quicker than when I listen. And I was like, no, I can't not hear this person narrate it. And the third reason I'll mention these 2 together is because I think if you enjoy one, you're likely to enjoy the other. The first one is Ohio by Stephen Markley. This is narrated by 6 different audiobook narrators, those being Caitlin Davies, Jamie Mackler, Joy Osmanski, Jonathan Todd Ross, Corey Brill, and Fraser Gibson. The premise of this is we are following 6 characters as they all converge on their small town in Ohio on the same day, and as you follow each of their perspectives, you find out why they're heading back to their small town, and you find out lots about their history and how they connect to the other characters. And as the story unfolds, a mystery is happening in the present day, as well as a mystery is being revealed in the past during their high school years, and those 2 mysteries are really tangled up with one another. So I will say this is a very dark book. This has some quite difficult scenes to read, so definitely look up trigger warnings. Like especially, I would just say that there is some really difficult scenes of sexual abuse that I was not prepared for, that happened quite towards the end. But like, I wouldn't have known what people from Ohio sounded like, and these narrators were amazing. And like, even though they had like a similar accent, they all sounded really different. And I just thought they did such an amazing job, not even just in terms of like accent, but in terms of like pace. You can tell like one of the narrators is, for much of the book, incredibly high. He's taken copious amounts of drugs, and like you can tell the way the audiobook narrator narrates his voice, he sounds really frantic, he speaks faster than all the other characters. You can tell he's like, you can 100% tell he's high. It's just done incredibly well, and I absolutely, like, my mind was blown listening to this on audio. Like, stellar performance, just amazing. And the next book is The Rabbit Hutch by Tess Gunty. This is the first book I'm going to talk about that is narrated by the author. However, Tess Gunty is not the only narrator. In large part, this is narrated by one voice. I'm pretty sure that voice is Tess Gunty, but there are also a few other audiobook narrators, those being Kirby Hayborn, Kyla Garcia, Scott Brick and Suzanne Torren. So this novel opens with a 17-year-old girl called Blondine being sort of brutally attacked by 3 teenage boys she lives with in an apartment block called the Rabbit Hutch, which is a low-cost housing complex. And it's set in the fictional town of Vacaville, Indiana, across 1 week in July. And then the book goes back in the past by a week, and you build up to the day of the attack. And the story is predominantly told by Blondine, so that is narrated by the author. But one of the teenage boys is quite a prominent voice. There are also a few like newspaper articles sprinkled throughout the book. There is also a phenomenal obituary, which is read by one of the audiobook narrators. And that section on audio was like blew my mind. And I got a physical copy of this as well. And there was a section that I'd listened to narrated, and I wanted to like read it again. And I had a look and like read it out loud, and it was still great. But God, it was so much better listening to the audiobook narrator narrate it, because they were amazing. This was like so good on audio. They did such an amazing job, and Tess Gunty just has a beautiful voice. Like, even had the other audiobook narrators not been involved, like, I wish she would narrate more audiobooks, not just her own books, because her voice was just really sort of gentle. And at times this book is quite unforgiving and quite harsh, so having it narrated by somebody with this really gentle voice who sound like they'd be like a really lovely person was quite nice. So I would highly recommend this one. And then again, when I think of audiobooks and I think of like an amazing performance, this is one that always comes to mind, and that is Small Island. This is written by Andrea Levy and amazingly narrated by Andrea Levy. And the reason why I say that's amazing is because this book has 4 different perspectives, and each of them have a different accent, okay? So we're following 2 married couples. 1 couple are from Jamaica and 1 couple are from England. But within each of those couples, they're from different areas of their own country. So the Jamaican wife is very well spoken, and the husband is from a more rural area. And then the reverse is true in the English couple. The husband is very well spoken, and the wife is the daughter of a farmer in, I think, Yorkshire. And all of their accents are spot on, and they sound like I had to check several times when I was listening to this one that there weren't other people involved, because I literally couldn't believe this was the same person reading all these voices. Just amazing. This is like one of the best historical fiction books, well, one of the best books I've ever read. I read this book when I was 16, and I reread it a couple of years ago and listened on audio, and like my mind was just blown. It is an amazing book. If you haven't read it and you like books, then definitely read it. But especially if you like historical fiction, like, this is amazing, and do not miss out on the audio because it is brilliant. So this is set in 1948. And we're following this couple who are part of the Windrush generation, and they come over from Jamaica and they're trying to start this life. And the wife comes over after the husband, and she is expecting London to be amazing and everybody to be super welcoming, and that isn't what she finds, and she feels quite betrayed by her husband. And they are also renting a room in a house owned by a white landlady, and she is one of our other points of view. And lots of people down the street are really racist. They don't want black residents living down their street. They think it's driving down the house prices. And so they treat both the black tenants really poorly, but also the white landlady. And so you follow all of that story. And then the white husband is fighting, I think from memory, he's in India, and you get his perspective later in the novel. This is just amazing, like the way their lives overlap, the way this book comments on race and class and gender and power and powerlessness is just amazing. And there's so many scenes from this book that I will like always remember, and she just did such a brilliant job of narrating this one. And the next book is Boy Parts. This is the last fiction book I'm going to talk about. This is narrated by the author Eliza Clark, and I love this. This is following a young woman who lives in Newcastle. She is a photographer, but she photographs young men who she has put in very vulnerable situations. And as you follow the story, things start to escalate, and you start to question whether there's like an abuse of power going on. Things get pretty dark and twisted. And this book is really turning on its head the idea of the patriarchy and who's in control. And it's sort of telling the story where like a woman gets to take back that control, which you think you'd like, but actually like once you start reading it, you really don't. And a lot of this book is about questioning the narrator's memory and how much of what she's telling you is actually true, or how much she's like imagining because of some sort of psychosis. And I think that comes across really well on audio, like the moments when the narrator like sort of comes around and is like where did this photo come from? Like where did this like smashed glass come, you know, like where what's going on? That comes across really well, but when narrated by the author. And also like I just love most accents from Northern England, and so it was like a delight to listen to this with the actual accent, because I wouldn't have been able to imagine that in my head because I'm rubbish at accents. The next one is Know My Name by Chanel Miller. I'm sure lots of you have read this one. I adored this, and as with many of these, I'd like to reread it. This is a memoir. Chanel Miller was known as Jane Doe during the Stanford rape trial, and she famously read out her sort of message to the court, and it was published, and then she revealed who she was. And this memoir looks into what it's like to be at the hands of the criminal justice system, in particular in America, when you are a woman accusing a man of a sexual crime in a world that allows these things to happen to women and usually blames women for these crimes. This book is so amazing in that it's incredibly angry and so full of life, and really gets across the emotions, the despair of the situation, but also explains the like minutiae of just the like frustration of the paperwork and how long everything takes, and what it's like to try and tackle the criminal justice system, like how hard it is to actually get justice, not just in a like way of feeling powerless, but in the fact that like it's just logistically difficult to do. It's made to be hard to do. And again, I just remember so many scenes from this, and I remember her voice reading them so beautifully. She has a wonderful voice, and yeah, I loved this one on audio. I would listen to it again in a heartbeat, and I always recommend this to people to pick this up on audio. The next one is Inferno, a memoir of motherhood and madness by Catherine Cho. This could be quite a hard one to listen to if you are pregnant or planning to be a mother, because Catherine Cho developed postpartum psychosis very soon after having her young son. Her and her partner were children of Korean immigrants to America that had decided to live in London. And very soon after having their baby boy, they decided to go back to America and sort of do like a road trip to visit all of their family members. And during that period, Catherine got very ill and was admitted to a psychiatric ward involuntarily. And what I love about this is, I mean, again, she just has a beautiful voice. This book is incredibly poetic and lyrically written. She looks back at a lot of like Korean mythology and beliefs, and hearing her tell those was beautiful. And the book is set up in a really interesting way in that you have a chapter while she's on the ward and then a chapter looking back at how she got there. And I think that's a really brilliant structure because it isn't too relentless in terms of her being in the ward, and it allows you to like meet her on like an even playing field. I feel like if you'd met her and just heard about the ward, then like you wouldn't have like been with her on the journey and like felt what it was like for her to like literally lose her mind. And the way in which this is structured just really gets that across. This is just a brilliant book. I cannot say too much how beautifully written this is. I think if you enjoy a book that's just on sentence by sentence level, beautifully written, this is definitely one to give a go. And she narrates it wonderfully. And you can really hear the emotion in her voice as she talks about this period of her life. It's just wonderful. Then we have Sitting Pretty, The View from My Ordinary Resilient Disabled Body. This is by Rebecca Taussig, and this is a memoir in essays, which are 3 words I love to hear. This is brilliant. I think I just loved listening to this. I think she has a really wonderful voice. I follow her on Instagram. I also follow Chanel Miller, and they're both just great. Like the things they post on Instagram, the way they talk, the way they express themselves is just brilliant. So I recommend following both of them. Rebecca Taussig had an illness when she was a child that left her paralysed, I think from the waist down. And so she's in a wheelchair. The book is talking about what it was like growing up in that situation and how really her parents didn't treat her any differently. And so she entered the world as a teen and as an adult expecting everybody else to view her like that, and actually she was confronted with this world that really didn't welcome her, and in fact at points felt like it was resisting her being part of the world at all. And so she talks about all that, but in talking about all that she's also like incredibly funny and warm and kind. But she also manages to be super informative and educational in a way that doesn't feel at all like, let me relay this to you. It doesn't feel, it feels at all points really blended with her story. I was just deeply interested in everything she had to say. And yeah, I love loads of the facts she spoke about. Like, for example, in a couple of the essays, there's an essay where she is a teacher and she's having a debate with some of her students about disability. And they're talking about deafness, and one of the students is saying, well, yeah, I just like think that if you were deaf, you would definitely want that to be like resolved. You would want to not be deaf. And she's trying to get past that. Like, a lot of this book is about the idea of able-bodied people thinking that disabled people should want to be cured, thinking that that's the aim, thinking that living a disabled life is somehow less than. And the way in which she gets that across is brilliant. And she says to this student, how did you get here? And he says, I walked. And she says, okay, you walked through the city? And he's like, yeah. And she's like, and what were you doing when you were walking? And he's like, I don't know, I was listening to music. And she was like, so you had your headphones in? And he's like, yeah. She said, could you hear anything around you? Could you hear the traffic? Could you hear the traffic lights? No. And she's like, so you're saying it's dangerous for somebody to be deaf because they may not hear like the traffic around them, but you have elected to not hear the traffic around you, and you've still got here and you're still fine. And in fact, that's something like loads of people do. I just love the way she told that, and hearing her say all that. She really gets across other people's voices when she's having a discussion with them. And this was just a joy. I just loved listening to this, and will like anticipate anything she brings out in the future, and we'll definitely listen to it on audio. Then we have My Time Among the Whites, Notes from an Unfinished Education by Janine Capo-Crusette. This is also a memoir in essays. So the author is a first-generation American immigrant. Her parents came from Cuba and raised her in Miami. And this essay collection explores what it's like to be the child of immigrants, especially because she can pass as white. So each of the essays focuses on different themes. One of the essays that I think a lot of people talk about, because it is a brilliant essay, is about her going to Disney World in Florida. And like, when I say that, I can get how, if you haven't read this, you'd be like, how does that look at like race and the immigrant experience? But it really does. Like, the way she talks about Disney World is so interesting. There's an essay about when she first arrives at college and how her family are like expecting a really different experience because she's the first person in her family to go to college, and she gets there and like her family were expecting to stay for a few days and help her settle in, and they thought that was like just what happened, and how there's all these other students there from these white middle class families, and like all their parents are just like, right, see ya, and she feels really out of parts and isolated and unsure of herself. And she feels at a lot of points in her life that she's never completely sure-footed. When she's in the world where she has to sort of integrate with white people, she's never completely confident, never feels completely welcome, and also hears things said about immigrants because people don't realise that she is a child of immigrants. They assume she's white. And then when she's with her family, there's all these expectations put on her as a woman in her culture, and they want different things from her that she doesn't really want because she's been raised in America. This is a really complicated discussion, and she's also really funny, and so that's why I would recommend listening to this one, because the way she delivers a lot of the humour. I just remember, I remember queuing in a Tesco Express to pay for my food shopping whilst listening to one of these essays, and that's such a boring thing to remember, but the section I was listening to was so funny that I will always remember being in that queue. And then we have The Gender Games, The Problem of Men and Women from Someone Who Has Been Both by Juno Dawson. This was a delight to listen to. Juno Dawson is hilarious, and the way in which she performs this one is brilliant, so you have to listen to it on audio, because I can't imagine the humour would have got across so well, like in physical form. This is a memoir about her initially living as a queer man and then coming out as a trans woman, and how her family dealt with that, how she dealt with that, what it was like to transition, and just loads of really hilarious anecdotes. In particular, there's lots of really funny stories about her sex life. This book is just wonderful. It was so fun to listen to. It's really warm. It takes the piss out of homophobic and transphobic people in a really sort of joyful way, and I just had a riot listening to this one. It was really fun. And then one, again, that I can remember like precisely where I was when I was listening to it is Eloquent Rage, A Black Woman Discovers Her Superpower by Brittany Cooper. This is an essay collection which came out a few years ago, and it came out at the time when there was lots of discussion of like the black angry woman, and it sort of attacks that stereotype and also embraces it. So for example, there are essays in this book on Serena Williams and how people treat her and demand certain things of her and celebrate her while attacking her. There's essays on Michelle Obama, there's essays on Beyonce, and one essay that I got so much out of and just really, really enjoyed and would happily have like read a whole book on was discussing the concept of welfare queens and how there was a period in American history where lots of black male artists were talking about welfare queens in their music, and that was really embraced at the time by politicians as well, this idea that there were these black single mothers cashing all these welfare checks and they were richer than most middle class people. And there was a lot of hate spewed by a lot of people about this notion that was completely untrue. And at the time, actually, Brittany Cooper proves that the statistics prove the inverse of that, and that in fact a lot of black women were working 2 jobs, supporting their family like single-handedly, and a lot of black men who were fathers were unemployed. And she talks about how both popular culture and politicians perpetuated this myth, and all these myths serve to like denigrate black women. This essay collection is just amazing, and an essay collection that sort of really delves into like popular culture when talking about this really important topic. And I think those two things, I guess when I read about these topics usually, I don't really usually read about them talking about popular culture, and so this one really stood out to me. And again, she did a really great job of narrating it, and I just really enjoyed this one on audio. And then lastly, we have How We Fight for Our Lives by Saeed Jones. This is a beautiful memoir. Saeed Jones is a poet, and he has a few collections out. I haven't read any of them. I really need to. You can 100% tell he's a poet when you read this one. So lyrically written. There are so many sentences that just sound like they're from a poem. This is a coming-of-age memoir about what it was like for Saeed to grow up as a young gay black man in the South. And this is also a love letter to his mother. His mother really struggled with him being gay, and so this book talks about what it was like being raised by this single mother, how much he admired her, how strong and brilliant and beautiful she was, but how she also couldn't really accept him for who he was. This is also a grief memoir, and it writes about grief beautifully. And hearing him tell his story was just like, felt like a privilege. Like the way he read it was beautiful, and when he spoke about his mother, you could just feel the love in his voice. There's a section when I remember waiting for a bus listening to it where he first introduces his mother and he describes her skin and her hair and the way she moves, and I could just feel the love in his voice, and it was just like pure poetry the way he described her. It was wonderful. Again, I want to reread all of these, but this is one that I just remember like being, doing things out and about and just pausing because I was like, oh my God, like, that was breathtaking. So yeah, I highly recommend this memoir, like however you read it, but in particular, his delivery on audio was just beautiful. So I would highly recommend the audio. Those are 20 amazing audiobooks I think you should listen to if you haven't already. I need to go now and have a drink because I'm incredibly thirsty. I have no idea how long this video is, but I'm sure it's obscene and I can look forward to editing it now. I would love audiobook recommendations. I love listening to a good audiobook, both fiction and non-fiction, so please put your recommendations down below. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye.